Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Ervin. I am the Senior Vice President of Empower Mississippi, and I am honored to be joined on stage today by two very distinguished panelists, Arkansas State Senator Breanne Davis and President and CEO of EdChoice, Robert Enlow. Thank you both for joining me here today. To sort of set the stage for our conversation today, I want to start by talking about an idea that we call education freedom. And education freedom is really referring to the ability of parents to select the best educational opportunity for their children. It recognizes that all children are unique, full of potential, and deserving of a high-quality education that meets their individual needs. And it's much bigger than one specific policy proposal. It includes things like traditional public schools and open enrollment. It includes things like charter schools, micro schools, homeschooling. It also includes things like virtual learning and educational therapies and tutoring and so much more. Over the last several years, we've really seen a swell of support around the country for this idea that we call education freedom. And just earlier this year, our sister state to the northwest, Arkansas, passed the LEARNS Act, which I think really supports education freedom. So Senator Davis, I want to start with you. What was the LEARNS Act and what was included in that legislation?
The LEARNS Act was truly a comprehensive education reform for the state of Arkansas. It was a 145-page bill, and it included everything from school safety to literacy programs, grow your own teacher programs, and ultimately universal school choice. And so we really put everything in there and tried to address everything we could because we needed true comprehensive reform in Arkansas.
Yeah, and I imagine that a bill of that magnitude was really tough to get passed. And I imagine it was pretty tricky to navigate politically. How were you able to get it across the finish line? And what was your message to the citizens of Arkansas that helped build support?
Well, the first thing is we have a very influential, strong governor, and that was really great for us. I mean, she campaigned for 2 years on this and talked about it everywhere she went. And so the state overwhelmingly elected her. She, I think, had more votes than any other person that's run for governor in Arkansas's history. So we knew that there was a strong mandate from the people of Arkansas to reform our education system. We've got 35% of third graders across Arkansas that are reading at or above grade level by the time they finish third grade. And that statistic really holds true when you look at 10th graders. You still have around 35% of 10th graders that are reading proficiently by the time they finish 10th grade. So there was no ground being made up through the school system. So we knew that we had to do something. It was her #1 priority. And it was hard because there's a lot of different groups that oppose or pull at different parts of the bill for different reasons. But I think just continuing to message and explain, taking the time to sit down and have those conversations and say, no, this is what the bill actually does. This is what it means. This is how we're doing it in a smart, practical way. We were able to really hold everyone together for a little bit to get it done.
Yeah, what were some of the messages that you found were effective in addressing some of the concerns of folks who were opposed to the idea of an ESA?
I think just the practical way we did it when we explained, you know, in 3 years we'll have universal school choice, and in year 1 we just really limited it. So in year 1 we have a small group of people. We have students with disabilities, first-time kindergarten students, foster students, either previous or current, and so we kind of had a group, active military, and we put a cap on it. So we knew year 1, it's only going to cost this much. It's about this many students, and it's these specific students. In year 2, we grow it a little bit more, cap it at 3% of our student population across the state, and extended it to first responders. And, you know, we kind of went from there, and then year 3, ultimately universal. So I think just saying, look, we're doing it in a smart way. We've already seen success with the education freedom accounts that we have, which is for students with disabilities. So let's just roll into that and build on that.
Yeah, and Senator Davis, you mentioned the education freedom accounts, and it's my understanding that programs like this are referred to by a lot of different names across the country. For the purposes of our conversation today, I'll simply refer to those as education savings accounts, or ESAs for short. And that's a specific policy option that's gained a lot of momentum across the country. Robert, What is an ESA and how does it work?
Well, that's a large question. There's a simple answer to that question and there's a hard answer to that question. So the simple answer is ESAs are taxpayer funds that parents can use to customize their education for their children, right? So it's not funds that go directly to one school or another. It can, but it can also go to one school for a half a day and then customize in a tutor. Or if they have a special needs child, they can have a morning therapy session that they bring in, and in the afternoon at a charter school if it works that way. So the idea is ESAs are basically taxpayer funds that are put onto an online platform that parents can use to customize their child's education. The longer answer, which I think is important for your audience here, is we as a society in our states and in your state decide to fund public education writ large, right? So 50% or more of every state's budget is in K-12 education. So if you want to talk about where the Benjamins are, which I heard earlier, it's in K-12 education. We decide to use those in 2 or 3 different ways, right? So public funds are collected based on where you live and they're distributed to a traditional public school system. Or public funds are collected where you live and are given to families to go to charter schools. Or in the case of your special needs program, public funds are collected and they're given to parents to go to a non-public school. The difference for the ESAs is you're not bound by a school. You're not bound merely by a school. You can basically use those dollars to customize and do more than schooling. You can do schooling, you can do therapies, you can do curriculums, you can be even educated at home in a hybrid way. So it's really coming into the 21st century. And when I heard the comment about schools in the 100 years, it's actually, our schools look today the same they looked when they started with Horace Mann in 1840. And so in terms of layout. So I think this ESAs are bringing all of this into the 21st or 22nd century by basically unbundling the concept of where you go to school from that you're getting educated.
Yeah, and it sounds like ESAs are a little bit different from some of the other education freedom policies we talked about just a minute ago, like open enrollment in charter schools. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how those are different?
Yes.
Or how they may work together?
Well, they do work together. They can. I mean, ESA can be overlaid on all of those things. So an ESA can be used in West Virginia at a traditional public school if they have every public school can set up an amount that they charge per course in West Virginia. And if they do so, a family can use monies for those courses. Same thing would be true of a charter school. A charter school is ostensibly a publicly funded school that is independently run, right? A voucher program, which you have in many states, is public funds going to families to go to non-public schools. And your traditional open enrollment is when you live in one district and the school district in another district says, I'm okay to have you come over, right? And so there are lots of different choices already. We already know in America how you can access choice outside of school choice. You can access it by moving. You can access it by paying a tuition, or you can access it by lying or knowing someone. And so the whole point about school choice is to change that to say, look, families should deserve these funds and let them learn to customize, let them have the power to customize like they're going to do in Arkansas.
And I'm glad you mentioned the vouchers. I think sometimes we can confuse vouchers and ESAs, but they're different,
They're
right?
very different. Yeah, the difference between ESAs and vouchers are very simple. A voucher, a parent that gets a scholarship to go to a non-public school, it's single use. An ESA is multiple mixed use. And that's the important point. What it's allowing is it's allowing families a lot more freedom to customize.
And we've seen a lot of states that have begun talking about ESAs or have moved towards ESAs or expanded their ESA programs. I think we're up to, is it 13 states in America that have an
Correct.
ESA program?
Correct.
And 8 of those are universal, or is it 6?
There are now 9 universal states, soon to be 10, and 8 of those are ESA states.
Why do you think so many states are turning to ESAs right now?
So I think a couple reasons. So the momentum for choice was happening already from 2016 onwards. We already had known that. So when we started as an organization in 1996, there were 5 school choice programs operating in America. And up to last year, there is now 72 programs operating in 32 states or 33 states, DC and Puerto Rico. So we knew that there was momentum. But what happened was this momentum for choice, particularly universal choice, was supercharged by that thing we call the pandemic. Right? And so what the pandemic did is it allowed families, whatever position they had, whatever reason, to look under the hood of how their kids were getting educated and decide, I want to do something different. And so when all of a sudden on March 13th, 2020, everyone became an educator. And so what happens is families began to say, oh, wait a minute, hold on, I want to customize, I want to personalize this, and I'm seeing what's going on and I don't know if I like that. And then the other part I say about this, it's actually better politics. Right? And here's why that's important. An ESA basically is coming alongside a family to say, what do you need? It's not saying I want a public school or a private school, I like a charter school or a private school. It's basically saying I want my families in my district and where they live to be able to do what is best for their children. And if that includes their traditional schools, fantastic. If that's a hybrid option, that's great. So I think the three reasons that they're becoming really, there are 111 school choice bills that were introduced this year in 40 states. 79% of them were ESAs, right? So it's dramatically growing, and it's because I think parents saw what happened in the pandemic. Parents wanted to personalize. They wanted something safe for their children. They believe safety is a big deal. They wanted teachers who in front of their kids that love their kids in a small environment. And it's just great constituent politics, to be honest with you. It's really important that you come alongside families and give them what they need. Again, it doesn't matter where they go. We're sector agnostic here in my organization. We don't care where a family goes to school, only that they get educated and they have the power to choose.
So let's talk a little bit about how ESA programs are structured. And states are all unique and different in how they structure their ESA programs. And some have chosen to limit participation. And they do that in a number of different ways. Some states have limited participation just by financial caps, what the legislature appropriates. Some of it is participation caps, so limiting on the number of people who can participate. Some limit it to students who participated in public school the previous year. And still others limit participation to individuals or students with disabilities. Like here in Mississippi, we have an existing ESA for students with disabilities and special needs. Robert, is there a right way or a wrong way to do that? Should states that are looking to either expand or implement a new program consider participation limits?
I mean, so every state has to do what its legislature and its policymakers think is right and what works for them. I think what we have learned over 27 years is when you have a fight about the parent's right to choose an education that's best for their kid, if you have the same fight for a limited program that you have for a big program, right? So the fight that you had here in Mississippi to pass the special needs ESA will be the same exact fight that you have to pass a universal choice program that allows everyone to choose. And so our view is that we believe that everyone should have a choice, but legislatures can do this. Like in Indiana, when we passed I was saying to the center, when we passed at that point, the largest school voucher bill in the country with Governor Daniels, that happened, one of the stories behind that is I got a call because the legislature, the opposition had gone to Illinois for a while, and we had been passing this big comprehensive program just like Arkansas. And I got this call and said, I need a number. And I'm like, no, there's no number. It has to be universal. She goes, I need a number. And then I said, well, I'll give you a number. She goes, then double it. And so the answer was we created a program that started with 7,500 kids, then 15,000 kids, and then universal, knowing that it would never get to that because the reality is it won't do that. And so every state's different. But the reality is every family should be free to choose, and however you guys decide to do that in your state, if that's putting caps on it in a meaningful way that says this is how we want to grow our program, you can look at it that way. But our argument would be you have the same fight that you have for a small program as you have for a big program.
Yeah, and Senator Davis, in the LEARNS Act, all students in Arkansas will be eligible to participate in the ESA by the 2025-2026 school year. Am I right?
Yes.
Why do you think it was so important for all students in Arkansas to be included in that new ESA program?
Well, I think it's important that all students have the ability to choose, that we don't pick and choose which students qualify and which ones don't. And that was really important to our governor. It shouldn't matter where you live or your zip code. That should not determine the type of education that you qualify for. And if you have educational needs that are not being met in the school that you're at, then you should have the ability to choose something different for yourself and for your children, for your family, whatever it is. So it was important, and that's where I think we went with caps, because I think it makes people feel a little safer. Like, we want to make sure as legislators, and in Arkansas we have to have a balanced budget. And so you don't want to say it's open for all, and what if 100% of students sign up, then how are we going to pay for it? And of course, we know that's never going to be the case. But to be good lawmakers, I think we have to make sure that what we're doing we can actually pay for, not just this year, but next year and the next, and that it's sustainable. And so we put those caps in place, and we haven't even met the cap in year one. We had the cap at about 7,000 students. And we've had roughly about a little over 5,000 sign up. 38% of the students that signed up this year are students with disabilities, and 32% of the students that signed up are first-time kindergarten students. So We didn't even meet our own cap, which is good, but we had a really strong response. So I think there's a balance in, what people can handle and what you're willing to do as a legislator, and make sure that you have bounds around that if that fits your state and it makes everybody feel a little safer in the decisions they're making.
So before the new ESA that was brought about by the LEARNS Act, Arkansas had an existing ESA as well, right?
Yes.
Through the LEARNS Act, did you expand that ESA, or is this a new program that can be used with that existing program?
We rolled the existing program into the new program, and we did some modifications for those students because it was strictly students with disabilities who were at 200% or less than the federal poverty level. So we rolled them into the program, and then we allowed them to stack our ESAs with something we call the PIAC, which is the Philanthropic Investment in Arkansas Kids. And so they could stack those two together because we know it does cost more money to educate students with special needs that maybe have disabilities. And so just being able to make sure we've got some actually really cool schools in Arkansas that educate those kids exclusively, some of those students, and they do a phenomenal job, and they have waiting lists of hundreds of kids waiting to get in. So we really wanted to make sure that it was still available in a financially practical way for those families.
As states across the country are talking about ESAs, there seem to be some pretty common concerns that consistently come up. And so I want to talk about a few of those right now. And the one that I'll start with is the concern that an ESA program would harm public schools. And I think we hear that a lot. As you both know, traditional public schools may be one of or the largest employer in their district, especially in rural areas. And there's a concern that ESAs and ESA programs may potentially take money away from public schools, even when some public school advocates would say that those schools are already underfunded. Senator Davis, how did you address those concerns, especially with rural lawmakers in the LEARNS Act, and when you were talking about it with those legislators?
Yeah, well, we did a few different things that probably don't apply here, so I won't get in the weeds on consolidation and how we close schools in Arkansas. We lifted some of those things to make everyone in smaller school districts feel more comfortable, to let them know we're not looking to shut down schools. If you're a small school and you're doing a phenomenal job educating students, like, you're thriving and you should stay open, and that is the best thing for those kids. And right now there's not a lot of, well, there's not really private schools in some of those more rural areas. So when you talk about school choice and students choosing maybe to go to a private school, you're really talking about the more urban areas in Arkansas. Those are the places that we have, several private schools. And so, of course, we hope that changes as years go on, and that there are some different educational options for students that live in rural places. But that by no means, in Arkansas, we're constitutionally mandated to provide equitable education for students. And about 50% of our state budget goes to K-12 education right now. And so I think just talking through that really to help alleviate some of those fears, and then like we said with the caps and stuff like that, to let it play out, really helped out.
And Robert, EdChoice has looked a lot at ESA and ESA type programs around the country. What impact, if any, have you seen on public schools as a result of these types of programs?
It's a great question, and certainly something we should all be concerned with. So a couple questions about this. What do we know about how school choice affects public school test scores? Right? Do public schools in areas or states that have a high percentage of choice students, do they do better? Right? And the answer is there have been 29 peer-reviewed studies about this issue. What happens to traditional public school test scores in areas where they have high choice programs? Of those 29 programs, 26 or 90% find that public school test scores actually rise in areas with higher choice. So the public schools tend to respond really strongly. Second question is, well, what will happen to budgets? Will budgets go down? Will budgets go up? What will the harm be? There's a lot of conversation that we should have about that. First of all, in my home state, and this is true of everyone, a traditional school gets a third grader who lives in the Indianapolis public school area district will get about $18,000 to go to a traditional school. They'll get federal, state, and local resources. That same third grader, and this is, I'm sure, going to be true here, will get about $9,000 to go to a charter school. They'll get the state resources and some federal resources and no property tax, right? That same child who decides to opt into the private school choice program and go to St. Monica, where my kids went to, which is a high Latino area, will get $5,000. Why is that child worth $13,000 less? They get no property tax. So the answer we know from the data, how does this impact traditional public schools budgets? It actually doesn't harm them, right? It actually helps them, because when every child who goes, just like when they go from one public school district to another public school district, you don't hear traditional schools say this is a bad thing, right? Even though the money follows the kids after time, right? So the conversation that we have from the data, there have been, actually on that number, we know there have been 74 studies on whether school choice impacts public school budgets negatively. Of those, 67% have found, 67 or 87% have been finding positive impacts, and only 6% found null impacts, that is, no impact, right? So basically, 97% have found that there's no negative impact to traditional school budgets. In this state, right here, your 3 programs, I looked at it today, have saved the state roughly $11 million. Right? And that's because every child who takes the scholarship gets less than they would if they would go to a traditional school. So we know from the data over time that traditional schools are actually responding. Their test scores go up. We know that the budgets aren't being hurt. We know that there's been no state that's actually seen a reduction in public school budgets as a result of choice. But more importantly, look at a state like Florida and Indiana, where they've had choice for 10, 12 years now, right? Florida and Indiana in particular are states, and Arizona you should look at. In my home state, again, the city of Indianapolis, which is the largest public school district, is one of the most robust choice environments in the state. Only 30% of the kids who live in Indianapolis public schools attend their assigned school. But they have a robust public school system, they have a great charter school system, and they have a really robust private school system. And our public schools are getting better faster. They're trying new things. They're trying innovative charter schools. They're trying contract schools. They're doing everything they can to ensure that they can provide the best possible service to families. So what we're knowing over time is it becomes a very positive impact over time for traditional public schools.
Thank you for that. Another concern that we often hear when talking about ESAs is the cost of those programs, particularly when we're talking about universal eligibility, where all children in the state are going to be eligible for that type of program. And Robert, I know your organization, EdChoice, has done a lot of research into the cost of these types of programs and the fiscal impact on states. Can you tell us what you found?
Yeah, those are the studies I mentioned. We actually do something, we call it the Fiscal Bible. We've looked at every single school choice program in America and looked at the fiscal impact on the state budgets and on local budgets. And over time, what you have found in every state that has school choice is actually saved states and local districts money. Right? It's actually, and part of this is very simple, right? Your traditional schools get 3 sources of funds, right? The average scholarship amount is almost always dramatically less than what the traditional public schools get for their children, right? And that's fine. That's just the decision the legislatures make, right? And that's exactly what will happen in Arkansas, right? They will get less for the scholarship than they will if they stay in their traditional school. But families want something different for their children, and that's why they choose that. Now, you could make an argument, like I do, that all dollars should follow all kids to all school opportunities, but that's not what's been happening, because there's variable costs and there's differences. And so we know from the data, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that public schools and budgets do not get harmed by having school choice. Actually, they get improved. Right? Now, the question is we need to find out how we spend that money. I don't know if you know this, but in Mississippi, since 1993 to 2022, you've seen a 13.2% reduction in the number of kids you've had in your public schools. Yet you've had a 9% increase in the number of staff you've hired. There's a lot of reasons for that, and there may be good reasons for that, but we have to start asking questions. If there's a teacher shortage, which there is, what's happening and who's getting hired? So what we're finding in school choice states is there's a lot more conversation about financial transparency.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Senator Davis, I'm curious, was cost a concern whenever you were discussing the LEARNS Act in Arkansas, especially for the ESA piece? And if so, how did you address that?
Yeah, cost is always a concern. It's something you're always talking about when you're dealing with education. And so what we did in the LEARNS Act was, in year one, we know that our ESAs are going to cost around $47 million. But throughout the bill, we allocated over $250 million new dollars into public schools. So when I say it was about comprehensive education reform, I really mean it was about comprehensive education reform for our state. And so just trying to get people to look at that and say, like, we're, paying our teachers more than anybody else in the country when adjusted for cost of living. We're hiring literacy coaches to go into our failing schools and work with our teachers on better practices to get kids to read. We're doing grow your own teacher programs because of the teacher shortage. People say, I can't get anyone to move out here to, Eudora or Hamburg or wherever in the state of Arkansas. That's a very rural place. And so we said, hey, if you want to grow your own teachers in your community, then we'll pay for their college and we'll pay for their master's degree. If they'll commit to teaching in a hard to hire place or a subject that's hard to hire, then we'll pay for their education. And so we have invested, we paid maternity leave an option that the state would pitch in if school districts wanted to do that for their teachers. The list goes on what we did in investment into our public schools. And that investment was worth over $250 million. And the ESAs were about $47 million in year one. And so we really tried to balance it out and say, our education secretary, Jacob Oliva, came from Florida, and he's probably one of my favorite people in Arkansas right now. He really is phenomenal. And we've been doing town halls across the state, and he says, listen, we know that even with school choice, that families are going to overwhelmingly continue to choose their traditional public school in their own neighborhood, in their own community. And we know that, and because of that, we want our public schools to be better. We want to invest in our public schools. It's not just about education freedom, like we're just not, it's not about that we're just trying to push students into private schools. We're not. We want families and kids to have the ability to choose and make those education decisions for themselves, but we want our public schools to be strong and thriving. And because of that, we're making the investment in teachers, we're making the investment in our local public schools, because we know that's where the majority of our students are going to continue to go.
If I could add one thing on that. So I love my legislator friends when they talk about cost. So I get it, $47 million. But they don't consider the other side of the ledger, right? And so most people who run their household budgets or their organizations will say, okay, it costs this much, but what am I saving or not spending, right? And so when you look at bills and you look at over time, what happens when you say the state is spending $47 million to give families choices, it's actually also deferring expenditures on kids that take the choice program. And if you actually zero those out, it's almost always a savings, right? And so legislative agencies tend not to look at both sides of the ledger. There's nothing wrong with that. This is what they don't do, right? Mm-hmm. And so I want you guys to think about that, because when you hear a choice program is going to cost millions and millions of dollars, well, again, it's almost impossible. If a child's getting $5 grand to go to a non-public school and they would cost 15 grand to go to a traditional school, where's the other money going, right? And so there has to be offset costs, unless you believe all costs are fixed costs, right? So the building light has to be turned on, the thing has to be paid. If that's true, though, if every cost in education is a fixed cost, then any child who comes into any new child into traditional schools doesn't need any money, right? Because if you think about fixed costs, right? If every cost is just fixed, then you don't need anything more. But that's not the way it is. You need to actually be thoughtful about that and fixed and variable costs, because that's how things work, right? So, I mean, I appreciate the cost that we spend, and they do. You guys have been spending, that's great. But when I, as an organization, try and understand how much states are spending, I always want to make sure that we look at both sides of the ledger. Like, how's the money being used, and B, what money's not getting expended? Property tax is a huge, and I would argue, potentially problematic issue, right? We should probably reform property tax in a large way, right? But it's important to remember what money, every child that leaves and goes to a charter school is not taking property tax with them. That's staying in the district, right? And that's an important point to recall and remember.
As we're talking about cost and the spending of government funds, another concern that often comes up is accountability. And we want to be responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars, and that means preventing any type of fraud, waste, abuse, or misspending. So, Senator Davis, in the LEARNS Act, can you talk a little bit about the accountability provisions that were included?
Yeah, we did two different things, financial and testing provisions. And so, like right now, if you're a homeschool student in the state of Arkansas, there really are no accountability measures to those parents. But if you apply for an ESA, which will be available to homeschool students next year, then we outlined, pretty clearly what the money can be spent on. And the idea is not that, that was one really common misconception, that people thought, well, all these, parents are going to homeschool their kids and they're just going to get a $7,000 check in the mail. Well, no, they're not. We're going to make sure that that money is being spent on specific things. And that a lot of times they're like pre-approved expenditures. So if you're, buying curriculum for your homeschool student, that money is going to the company to pay for curriculum. It's a pre-approved expenditure. Money really shouldn't be exchanging hands of parents. You shouldn't be, you will not be getting a check in the mail. And then you have to take a national norm recognized test at the end of the year. And we did the same thing for private schools. So students will, if you choose to go to a private school through an ESA, then that private school will get 4 quarterly payments. So and it's the same thing. You have to show that it can be, that it's spent on education-related things. There is an annual financial audit to ensure that you are spending the money correctly on things you should be spending money on. And those private schools will be, will be audited. Now, we were clear that they're not audited like open all your books and you can see everything, but you're audited for the expenditures of that student to ensure that you're spending the money on their education. And those students also have to take a test at the end of the year as well. And that'll be, aggregated data as much as it can be, if as long as there's enough students participating. So we'll be able to see publicly test scores from students, both homeschool and private school, that participate in our ESAs. And then we'll also have financial audits along the way to make sure that there is not fraud.
I think those accountability measures are so incredibly important, but we also want to make sure we don't make the program so difficult for parents that they're not able to utilize it, right?
Yeah.
Robert, I want to take a step back and look at this nationally, because there have been several states that have been doing ESAs for a long time. States like Florida and Arizona and Indiana that you mentioned. What are some ways that those states have found to make sure that those funds are being spent appropriately and not misspent?
So pretty much everything that the senator said. So we have financial accountability both in Indiana and Florida and Arizona, right? So you have to show that you're spending the money on the appropriate use, right? The schools can be reviewed from time to time, and the state boards of education or the Department of Education could go in and look at them. They have to take, in Florida and in Indiana, they take nationally norm reference tests if you participate in the program. So you have an understanding of how the schools and the kids are doing. We know in Arizona, for example, on the ESA program, so again, there's difference. So Florida was a tax credit scholarship program that just became an ESA program, right? And Indiana is a voucher program, which is not yet an ESA program, it's a special needs ESA. So those states have got a lot of accountability on the traditional private schools already, even before the program, right? So we know in Arizona, though, that has had an ESA program since 2011. The Auditor General does an annual report on the improper payments. The most recent improper payment report from the Auditor General of Arizona found a grand total of 1 improper payment for $30, right? Out of all of the millions and millions of dollars that families are using. In 2018, they actually found 900 improper payments, which ended up being about like 7%, which they then fixed, right? Which was great. By comparison, the Office of Management and Budget of this country says that the government-wide fraud rate or improper payment rate for all government programs is 16%. The free and reduced price lunch improper payment rate is 23%. So part of this conversation we have to ask ourselves is, we're looking to try and change education. So we're looking to trying to do something different. What level of risk are we willing to take to trust families? Ultimately, what do we trust families enough to do what's right for their kids with appropriate guidelines and barriers, right? So I'm much more open to having a more flexible accountability environment, and we know that states are moving towards that, because accountability, ultimately the first and most primary person to hold schools and education to account is parents. And we know that. In Arizona, again, for example, in the charter school sector, By the time the state decides to come along and close a school, a charter school, there are like 15 parents in it, right? So parents have already voted with their feet, they're already moving out, they already understand what's good and what's bad for them. So I think what we got to talk about here is there's not a lot of fraud, improper payments that are happening in the ESA program, and it just can't. When you design the program with a third-party payment system where you approve all the transactions prior to them being spent, it's impossible, right? As an online payment, it's just impossible. So that's an important point to make. We're not seeing that kind of improper payments anymore, and there's a ton of other accountability that already exists.
Yeah, while we're talking about accountability, I think that there's some concern when you talk about holding schools accountable that are serving students that participate in the ESA, like non-public schools. There seemed to be a concern with some of our private schools that an ESA type program would subject those schools to some overly burdensome regulations and rules that they're not subject to today, and essentially force them to operate like public schools. And I think what a lot of our private schools would tell you is one of the things that makes them effective and unique is that they're able to operate a little bit differently. And so, Robert, I think we've seen, like we said, 13 states that have adopted ESAs. Is that a concern that we've seen materialize in other states that have done ESAs?
So the concern is always there. So our foundation was started by Milton Friedman. So just by way of quick background, I came to the organization. It was called the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice in 1996. Prior to that, I was doing social work and doing liberation theology in England. And so I have come to this from a very different background. And so what I'm most concerned about, what Milton Friedman used to say, is regulation is the biggest thing we should always be worrying about, right? We should always be thinking about how are we stopping families from exercising their freedom, right? So that's something we should take seriously. The good news is that in 27 years, we haven't seen private schools get regulated as a result of choice, right? So we're not seeing that. What we're seeing is schools showing transparency to what they're providing, right? So that's an important question. Is there a difference between, we don't want every single school to look alike, right? And you could make an argument that our traditional schools have been overly regulated by accountability measures, right? That it's not actually been good for them to actually have such top-down centralized accountability. And so we know it hasn't necessarily increased test scores, right? It hasn't led to a lot of results. So we need to be rethinking accountability writ large. But when it comes to private schools and how they've been approaching the programs across the country, there's a reason why there are a 42% increase in the number of schools in Indiana that are participating in the program, of which 20% are new. There's a reason why there are over 700 new private schools in the state of Florida who are participating in the choice program. So there is a growth, and we should always be fearful of regulations on all sides, right? We don't want to have regulations that actually make it harder for schools to do their work. We need regulations that provide boundaries and guideposts, but not necessarily top-down control. And so I think what we're seeing across the country is a shifting of the conversation of accountability. One, first to put it towards parents. Two, to say that we should be thoughtful about what kind of regulation we have on our traditional schools, and to make sure that we show that private schools aren't getting regulated, because they're not.
And Senator Davis, how was the LEARNS Act, and in particular the ESA provision of that, received by the private schools in your state? And how did you address some of those concerns?
There was concern too. I think just saying, like, are you guys making us do anything? Do we have to change? And we said, no, you don't. You operate just as you are. And you know what? If you don't want to participate, you absolutely don't have to. We said the same thing to our homeschool parents who said, well, what if I don't want to test my kid? What if I don't want to? We said, that's no problem. You do not have to participate in the ESA program. You can continue homeschooling your student just like you are now. You don't have to opt into the program. And that's what we told our private schools as well. But we ended up having, I think, like 91 of our private schools opt into the program. I think it's been going really well during the application process. There wasn't a hiccup, but there was one thing they read that was like a federal rule that they had to agree to, that actually they'd been agreeing to since like the 1960s or something, but they just never paid that much attention. But because of the heightened fear that we were, trying to, make them do something, or, just that fear of, that we were going to try to make them do something, they caught it. And so we had to explain that, but that's just part of the process. And people just, I think that's just part of change, people being a little bit fearful of what's to come. are you really trying to, you know, slip a fast one on me? Like, what are we doing here? And so just working through those concerns and talking to people and saying, no, like, you've agreed to this since the 1960s. This is nothing different, and this is federal. It's not even us. And just showing them where it came from, it really put them at ease, and it's been smooth sailing so far.
That's great.
Yeah.
Another concern that we hear when we're having conversations here in Mississippi, and I think some of our colleagues have when they're talking about ESAs across the country, and we're sitting here today at the two Mississippi museums, which includes the Civil Rights Museum, there's a concern that ESA programs could lead to greater discrimination in our schools. And that could be on the basis of race, it could be on the basis of special needs, or a number of other factors. Robert, what would be your response to folks who are concerned that an ESA program could lead to greater discrimination?
I love that we're here in this museum. And obviously I mentioned what I did prior to this. If I felt as a person, as just right now as a moral person, if I felt that ESAs would do that, I'd quit today. And I'll tell you why. So what we do know from the studies is we have found, at least studies of voucher programs, ESA programs are new, studies of school voucher programs find that families who participate in them actually are more tolerant of each other's opinions, right? So it's really interesting. It's counterintuitive, but it's true, and it's peer-reviewed research. If you attend a private school, particularly religious private school, using a scholarship, you're going to actually be more open to other people's ideas, more tolerant of other people's opinions. This is something we want, right? This is something that's good. We absolutely, though, should make sure that there are boundaries and guidelines to make sure that schools do not discriminate, which they cannot do by law anyway, but we should make sure that that's true. Now, we know from the usage of school choice around the country that it's primarily been Black and brown families who are choosing them, right? If you look at Florida and Indiana, the vast majority of students who are wanting to choose these programs are the ones who want a different thing for their family, right? This is why our private schools in Indiana are getting more integrated than they've ever been. This is why the voucher program in Indiana, where our state is 7% Hispanic, it's almost 20% Latinos who are going to the private schools on the voucher. This is the reality because families want more options. There's a reason why in the pandemic, Black homeschooling went from 3% to 16% of the total. Families have power, and so we're sitting here, and I would ask us to think about how ESAs could lead to, I don't know if any of you remember these schools, the history of these schools, but could lead to a new Rosenwald school system, right? So the Rosenwald schools were post-Reconstruction, 5,000 schools all across the South, put together by Booker T. Washington and the head of Sears and Roebuck's, that were basically run by Black and brown communities for themselves, right? This is what I think ESAs can bring to this effort again, where I say this all the time in speeches where I'll say, hey, you've heard this thing, give a man a fish to eat for a day, teach him to fish to eat for a lifetime. I actually want to know who owns the pond, right? Because if you own the pond, you actually control what means of production you're having. And if an ESA can create new schools, new leaders, new ideas that are run by people of color, that's awesome. And that's what we're seeing around the country. That's certainly what we're seeing in the microschooling community. So I'm excited by the opportunity. And I think that over time, you know, despite some of the fears, that has not been borne out by what history has shown, at least modern history since 1990.
And that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. We're running a little bit low on time here, so I want to start wrapping it up. But I think the last question that I want to ask is one, we've talked about private schools and public schools and the impacts of ESAs on those, how ESAs work and what they are. But I want to close out with the most important piece, and that's the impact on the students. Our ultimate goal is to make sure that all students, regardless of their background, their race, or their zip code, have access to a high-quality education that sets them up for success beyond graduation. Robert, as we talked about, ESAs are not new, and there's now a lot of available research on the impacts of these types of programs on students. So what does the data show, and what kind of impact do ESA programs have on students?
So the data is, I'm a data nerd, so there are 187 studies, high quality studies have been done looking at the impact of private school choice on families, on public schools, on budgets. 87% of them find positive results. like 10% find null results and like only 3% find negative, right? So it's important to know about one thing with this. There has been no other education reform studied so intensely and so deeply as school vouchers and charter schools. You know how many studies there have been on class size? 2. There have been 187 studies on the impact of private schools and charter schools. So what we know, children who receive scholarships tend to do slightly better on tests, particularly black and brown kids. Not huge differences, to be honest, but they attain more. So they learn a little bit more, but they graduate at higher rates. They matriculate into college at higher rates. They persist in college at higher rates. This is super important. I don't want my child just to learn something on a test. I want them to be able to go to college and graduate from college and get a job, right? We also know that parents are dramatically more satisfied. When parents are choosing, the studies show that they're more involved in their kids' education, they're more involved in their kids' school, they're more involved with their kids' teacher, and they vote more, right? This is super important because it creates power, right? You also know that children who are in private school choice programs are in more safe environments, right? They're in more safe environments for themselves and their family. It could go on, right? But the point is look, every child is unique and has a different unique need. And if a non-public school works for a child, that's great. If a hybrid option works for a child, that's great. If a public school works for a child, that's great. The whole goal here is to ensure that families have power to choose. And the data shows pretty clearly when families are empowered to choose, their children are going to do better, right? And it's not just on a test score, it's in their lives. And I think that's what matters.
And Senator Davis, the LEARNS Act obviously was much bigger than just the ESA component. But I'm curious, how do you see the new education freedom accounts, the education savings accounts in Arkansas impacting Arkansas students and their families?
Well, I mean, I hope it'll drastically change the landscape of Arkansas, and think that it'll impact generations. I mean, the thing is, you know, we debate things like universal school choice and whether or not money should follow kids, but the truth is we're failing our kids across the country and in the state of Arkansas. When 35% or less of our third graders can read at or above grade level by the time they leave third grade, and we do nothing to intervene, we just pass them on and they're reading at the same level by the time they're in the 10th grade, we have a problem. And we have to have a different conversation. We can't say we're going to protect an institution at all costs. We have to say we're going to educate our kids to read, to know math, to learn, so that they can be successful, productive adults in society, so that they can lead happy, fulfilled lives. And if the conversation is just that, if the fight is that we're just keeping the status quo because we can't do this other thing out of fear of what might come of it, then we choose to continue failing our kids. And that's not okay. We cannot continue to say that 35% of our kids going to school 7 hours a day, not learning how to read, is acceptable. And so one thing that our governor says that I love so much when we do these town halls is she says, look, this bill isn't perfect. There is no perfect bill. There's no perfect piece of legislation. But we cannot continue to maintain the status quo. So we're doing this, and we're going to tweak it along the way, and if something doesn't work, we're going to fix it. But we have got to invest in our teachers. They are overworked, overburdened with paperwork and being micromanaged, and they do not have the time to teach our kids in the way that they used to. So we have got to invest in our teachers and streamline the way that we have them educate our kids. We've got to invest in our families. We've got to invest in our students. And so to me, I have 4 children. 3 of them are in public schools right now, and I have a 5-year-old with Down syndrome who's going to start school next year. And I heard a lot of different arguments, a lot of different things about how this was going to, the disability community came out against it and said, you're going to ruin education for children with special needs. And I was, pretty hurt and offended by that because I have a child with special needs, and I would never do anything to hurt the education of my kid. And the House sponsor of the bill, he also has a kid with disabilities. And so my point, I don't know where I was going, sorry, I kind of got, but my point is, I just get so, my point is that we need more education options across our state. And we have schools. What I hope is, we've got 2 schools in our state capital that teach specifically kids with disabilities. And there is a waiting list of 150 other kids trying to get in the doors. And I don't have an option like that for my child with Down syndrome. I'm looking at a public school or just a typical private school. And I hope that one day we see private schools across our state that are there to educate and meet the needs of our students with disabilities, because they are learning and they are meeting their own learning potential, and it is awesome, and parents are thrilled. I hope that we have, private schools and different education options in rural areas across our state, because it elevates the public schools, and it also takes off some of that learning burden with students that maybe cost a little more to teach. And that relieves our public schools of that financial and learning burden and puts them in a place where the students are getting their educational needs met, and the public school is able to better educate the kids that they have. So truthfully, I think it's going to change generations. I think our state will never be the same in the best way possible. And it's not going to happen next year or the next year. But as this continues on, and it is universal and people get used to it, I think that we'll see a larger demand. And in 10 years, I think fear will be gone. And I think we'll be really proud of the work we did, regardless of how scary and how hard it was today to do that work.
Can I just say amen? That's fantastic. And I want to thank both of you again for your time and for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us today. I also want to take a moment to recognize our education ambassadors. If you're one of Empower's education ambassadors, would you just raise your hand? I see a few of you throughout the audience. I would encourage you at a break, or if you see one of our ambassadors, I think they're wearing a special ribbon, seek these people out. Ask them their stories. Many of these families have participated in Mississippi's existing ESA program, and I think that they'll tell you how incredibly valuable that program is to our students with special needs in Mississippi. And as a reminder to our lawmaker friends who are in the audience, I've seen a few of you throughout the morning so far, that program is up for renewal in 2024, and we absolutely need to get that extended and reauthorized. So if you want to learn more about ESAs or education freedom, you can visit our website at empowerms.org. Be sure to check out Robert's organization's website, EdChoice.org, extensive research on school choice and school choice in America. And I just want to thank you both again. Please help me in thanking our wonderful panelists.